The biggest mistake people make is judging a stranger before they know his story. The words would not be spoken until much later, but the lesson began at 4:17 p.m. on a private jet waiting on the runway outside Atlanta. The cabin smelled faintly of fresh coffee and polished leather. Golden sunlight poured through the oval windows, painting long reflections across the aisle. Passengers settled into oversized cream-colored seats, checking phones, reviewing schedules, and preparing for another routine flight. No one noticed the tall black man who stepped quietly into the cabin carrying a worn leather duffel bag. Elijah Carter moved without drawing attention. His charcoal jacket was simple. His watch was hidden beneath his sleeve. There was nothing about him that screamed wealth, power, or influence. In fact, he looked more like a traveler returning from a long week of work than one of the most influential businessmen in the country. Elijah nodded politely as he reached his assigned seat near the front of the aircraft. Before he could sit down, a sharp voice cut through the quiet cabin. "Excuse me, sir." Several heads turned. Rebecca Collins stood near the galley, her navy blue uniform perfectly pressed. She had worked luxury flights for nearly 12 years and prided herself on spotting problems before anyone else did. Her eyes moved from Elijah's shoes to his duffel bag and then to the boarding pass in his hand. Something about him immediately triggered suspicion she could not explain. "May I see that boarding pass again?" she asked. Elijah handed it to her without argument. Rebecca studied the document for several seconds. Her expression hardened. Around them, conversations began to fade. Passengers sensed tension and quietly watched. Elijah remained calm. "Is there a problem?" he asked. Rebecca looked at him carefully, then glanced around the cabin. "This seat is reserved for authorized passengers," she said. A few people exchanged confused looks. Elijah blinked once. "I am an authorized passenger." The cabin grew still. Outside, baggage vehicles rolled across the tarmac beneath the orange glow of the late afternoon sun. Inside, the atmosphere felt colder by the second. Rebecca crossed her arms. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step aside while we verify a few things." Elijah could feel dozens of eyes on him now. Some curious, some skeptical, some already reaching conclusions. Yet his voice never changed. Of course. That answer seemed to surprise her. Most people would have argued. Most people would have demanded explanations. Elijah simply stood and waited. The silence stretched. Then a businessman seated across the aisle leaned toward another passenger and whispered something. A woman near the window glanced at Elijah and frowned. Assumptions spread through the cabin faster than facts ever could. Rebecca looked down at the boarding manifest one more time. Then her phone vibrated. She checked the screen. The color slowly drained from her face. And in that exact moment, somewhere beyond the aircraft door, 3 black SUVs came speeding toward the jet. Rebecca stared at the phone screen for a moment longer than she should have. The message was brief, but it carried a level of urgency she had never seen before. Her confidence wavered. She quickly locked the screen before anyone nearby could read it. Across the cabin, Elijah Carter remained standing beside his seat, calm and composed, as if nothing unusual was happening around him. The low hum of the aircraft's auxiliary power system filled the silence. Outside the window, the 3 black SUVs rolled to a stop near the jet. Their tinted windows reflected the orange light of the setting sun. Several passengers noticed them immediately. Curious glances shifted toward the runway. A businessman seated near the front leaned toward the window. "Who is that?" he whispered. No one answered. Rebecca swallowed hard and checked the passenger manifest again. Elijah's name was still there. Seat 2A. Confirmed. Authorized. Verified. She looked back at him. For the first time, uncertainty replaced suspicion. Yet pride would not let her back away so quickly. "There appears to be a delay," she said carefully. Elijah simply nodded. "I understand." His calmness frustrated her even more. Most travelers became impatient over far less. Delays, seating issues, misplaced luggage. But Elijah never complained. He never demanded special treatment. He never even asked why he had been singled out. The cabin door opened. Warm air drifted inside from the runway. 2 men in dark suits stepped aboard. Their presence changed the atmosphere immediately. They were not security officers. They were executives. Rebecca recognized one of them from company leadership meetings streamed during annual training sessions. Her heartbeat quickened. The older executive scanned the cabin and immediately spotted Elijah. Relief flashed across his face. He hurried forward. "Sir," he said, "thank goodness we found you." Several passengers exchanged confused looks. Rebecca felt a knot forming in her stomach. Elijah offered a polite smile. "I was never lost." The executive gave a nervous laugh. "Of course not, sir." His eyes briefly shifted toward Rebecca before returning to Elijah. The exchange lasted only seconds, but it told everyone watching that something important was happening. The whispers started immediately. A woman near the aisle lowered her tablet. A college student removed his headphones. Even the flight crew in the galley stopped pretending not to watch. Rebecca suddenly became aware of every decision she had made during the last 10 minutes. Every assumption, every judgment, every conclusion she had reached before knowing a single fact about the man standing in front of her. Then another vehicle arrived outside. This time the reaction from the executives was immediate. One of them checked his watch. The other straightened his tie. Both looked genuinely nervous. Elijah noticed. "Is something wrong?" he asked. The older executive forced a smile. "Not for you, sir." Before Elijah could respond, movement appeared at the aircraft door. Footsteps echoed up the boarding stairs. Heavy, deliberate, important. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. And when the next person stepped onto the jet, Rebecca Collins felt the blood drain from her face. The man who stepped onto the aircraft was Richard Whitmore, the chief executive officer of the airline itself. Rebecca had only seen him in corporate broadcasts and annual leadership meetings. Seeing him in person was different. The energy inside the cabin shifted immediately. Conversation stopped. Even the executives who had arrived earlier straightened their posture the moment he appeared. Richard moved quickly down the aisle, his polished shoes barely making a sound against the carpet. Rebecca opened her mouth to greet him, but the words never came. He walked right past her. Not a glance. Not a nod. Nothing. Instead, he stopped directly in front of Elijah Carter. For a brief moment, nobody spoke. The only sound was the distant hum of the engines and the soft rattle of an air conditioning vent above the cabin. Then Richard extended his hand. "Mr. Carter," he said, "I sincerely apologize for the delay." A wave of confusion swept through the passengers. Several people looked from Richard to Elijah and back again. Rebecca felt her stomach tighten. Elijah accepted the handshake with a calm smile. "There is no need to apologize, Richard." The use of his first name stunned everyone within earshot. Richard Whitmore was not the type of man people casually addressed by his first name. Yet Elijah spoke as though they had known each other for years. Richard glanced around the cabin and noticed the uncomfortable expressions. His eyes briefly landed on Rebecca. The look lasted less than a second, but it was enough to make her heart pound. "Is everything prepared for the Denver meeting?" Elijah asked. Richard nodded immediately. "Every board member is already waiting for you." A businessman seated near the aisle nearly dropped his phone. Another passenger quietly lowered a newspaper. The whispers started again, but this time they carried a different tone. Curiosity had become concern. Rebecca tried to make sense of what she was hearing. Board members, executive meetings, direct access to the chief executive officer. None of it matched the assumptions she had made only minutes earlier. Her training had taught her to evaluate situations quickly. Yet suddenly she wondered if she had evaluated the wrong things. Elijah finally took his seat. The afternoon sunlight illuminated the side of his face as he looked out the window. He seemed completely unaffected by the attention surrounding him. That calmness unsettled Rebecca even more. Most powerful people enjoyed displaying their importance. Elijah appeared to have no interest in it at all. Richard remained standing beside him. "The acquisition documents arrived this morning," he said quietly. "The board voted unanimously." Elijah nodded once. "Good." That single word carried more weight than an entire speech. Rebecca noticed several passengers exchanging worried glances. One man discreetly searched Elijah's name on his phone. The moment he saw the results, his eyes widened. He turned the screen toward his wife. Her jaw slowly dropped. Then another passenger searched. Then another. The realization spread seat by seat through the cabin like a silent wave. Rebecca watched their reactions and felt a growing sense of dread. She still did not know exactly who Elijah Carter was, but she was beginning to understand one terrifying fact. The man she had judged within seconds was far more important than anyone on that aircraft had imagined. Rebecca stood near the galley pretending to organize service items, but her attention remained fixed on the passengers. More specifically, on Elijah Carter. The cabin had changed during the last few minutes. Nobody said it aloud, yet everyone could feel it. The casual atmosphere that existed before had disappeared. In its place was a growing awareness that someone extraordinary was sitting among them. The businessman who had searched Elijah's name first was now staring at his screen in disbelief. His wife looked equally stunned. Across the aisle, another passenger quietly typed on a tablet. Then another. The pattern repeated throughout the cabin. Search results appeared. Faces changed. Eyes widened. One woman covered her mouth. A younger passenger looked toward Elijah and then quickly looked away as if afraid of being caught staring. Rebecca felt her pulse quicken. She finally reached for a tablet and entered his name herself. The result appeared instantly. Elijah Carter, founder of Carter Global Holdings, investor, philanthropist, owner of companies that employed tens of thousands of people across the country. Her throat tightened. She continued scrolling. Hospitals, scholarship programs, housing initiatives, disaster relief donations. Every article revealed another layer of a man she had completely misunderstood. The photographs online showed him standing beside children, community leaders, doctors, and educators. Yet the person sitting quietly in seat 2A looked exactly the same as he had 10 minutes earlier. Calm, unassuming, unconcerned with attention. Rebecca lowered the tablet. A strange feeling settled over her. It was not fear alone. It was the realization that she had formed an opinion long before she had any facts. Nearby, Richard Whitmore was speaking softly with several executives. Their expressions were serious. One handed him a folder. Another checked messages on his phone. Whatever meeting awaited them in Denver was clearly important. Very important. Yet Elijah seemed completely relaxed. He gazed out the window at the fading sunlight stretching across the runway. The golden reflection illuminated the cabin walls with a warm glow. For a moment, he looked less like a billionaire and more like a man enjoying a quiet evening flight. Rebecca could not understand it. Most powerful people demanded recognition. Most successful people expected special treatment. Elijah demanded neither. That only made her regret deeper. Then a voice came over the aircraft intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, departure has been delayed approximately 15 minutes. Thank you for your patience. A soft murmur spread through the cabin. Richard checked his watch. One of the executives leaned close and whispered something into his ear. The chief executive officer's expression changed immediately. His eyes shifted toward Elijah, then toward Rebecca. The look lasted only a second, but this time it carried unmistakable concern. Rebecca felt a chill run through her. Something else was happening. Something bigger than a delayed flight. Something bigger than a mistaken judgment. Outside, airport vehicles continued moving beneath the evening sky. Inside, tension quietly built with every passing minute. And then Richard's phone rang. The moment he saw the caller's name, his face went pale. Richard stared at the phone for 2 full seconds before answering. The cabin remained silent. Even the passengers closest to him could sense something was wrong. He stepped a few feet away and lowered his voice, but the tension on his face was impossible to hide. What do you mean the investors are pulling out? He asked. The words immediately caught the attention of the executives standing nearby. One of them froze. Another looked down at the folder in his hands. Richard listened for several more seconds before ending the call. When he turned around, the confidence he had carried onto the aircraft was gone. Elijah noticed the change immediately. Bad news? He asked calmly. Richard exhaled slowly. The acquisition may collapse. A nervous silence followed. The Denver meeting suddenly felt far more important than anyone had realized. The executives exchanged worried looks. Millions of dollars were at stake. Jobs were at stake. Entire divisions of the company depended on the outcome. Yet Elijah remained surprisingly calm. He folded his hands and listened. How much time do we have? He asked. Less than 3 hours, Richard replied. Several investors are demanding answers before they commit. One executive shook his head. If they walk away now, the entire expansion project could fail. Rebecca listened from the galley, her heart sinking deeper with every passing minute. The company leadership was treating Elijah as if he were the only person capable of solving the problem. She glanced at the search results still open on her tablet. The more she learned about him, the worse she felt. Articles described how he had rescued struggling businesses, funded hospitals, and created scholarship programs across the country. Thousands of people viewed him as a leader. Yet she had looked at him and seen none of that. She had only seen her own assumptions. The realization was painful. Across the cabin, a passenger quietly approached Elijah. "Mr. Carter," he said, "I just wanted to say it is an honor to meet you." Elijah smiled warmly and shook his hand. "Thank you." There was no arrogance in his voice. No sign that he considered himself more important than anyone else. That simple interaction only deepened Rebecca's regret. Then, another executive rushed onto the aircraft carrying a stack of documents. He handed them directly to Richard. "The latest projections," he said. Richard reviewed the papers and immediately looked toward Elijah. "Sir, I am not sure we can recover this." For the first time, the passengers saw concern in the chief executive officer's eyes. Elijah accepted the folder and calmly flipped through several pages. The fading sunlight reflected across the paper. The cabin grew completely still. Every person on board seemed to be waiting for his reaction. Rebecca found herself holding her breath. After a long moment, Elijah closed the folder and looked up. "There is a solution," he said quietly. Relief flashed across Richard's face. But before Elijah could explain further, another notification appeared on Rebecca's tablet. Her eyes widened. It was an internal company message marked urgent. And when she read the first sentence, her hands began to tremble. Rebecca stared at the message as if the words might change if she blinked. They did not. The internal notice was brief, formal, and impossible to misunderstand. Effective immediately, corporate leadership had launched a full review of the incident that had occurred before departure. Witness statements were already being collected. Security footage was being preserved. Senior management had requested complete documentation. Rebecca felt her mouth go dry. The cabin suddenly seemed smaller. The soft lighting, the polished wood accents, the scent of fresh coffee drifting from the galley all felt distant now. Around her, passengers remained focused on Elijah Carter. None of them knew what she had just read. None of them knew the storm building inside her chest. Across the aisle, Elijah sat quietly while Richard Whitmore and the executives reviewed documents around him. There was something remarkable about the contrast. Everyone else appeared rushed. Phones vibrated. Messages arrived. Deadlines approached. Yet Elijah remained perfectly calm. The orange glow of the sunset reflected across the aircraft window beside him. His attention stayed on the reports in front of him. Nothing about his posture suggested panic. Nothing about his expression suggested resentment. Rebecca could not stop thinking about that. If she had been treated unfairly, she knew she would have been angry. Yet Elijah had shown patience from the very beginning. Richard leaned forward. "If we cannot convince them tonight, we may lose the entire partnership." Another executive nodded. "The investors think the expansion is too risky." Elijah listened carefully. Then he turned a page and pointed to a section of the report. "They are looking at the wrong numbers," he said. "They are evaluating short-term exposure instead of long-term value." The executives immediately focused on the document. Richard's eyes widened as he followed Elijah's analysis. "I did not even notice that," he admitted. Elijah offered a small smile. "That is because everyone has been reacting to fear." The words settled over the group like a quiet lesson. Even passengers nearby seemed drawn into the conversation. Rebecca watched as the room slowly shifted around him. Problems that had appeared overwhelming moments earlier suddenly seemed manageable. Not because Elijah was louder than everyone else. Not because he demanded authority, but because he brought clarity. A few rows back, a passenger who had spent the last 15 minutes reading articles about Elijah quietly shook his head in amazement. "No wonder they needed him," he whispered. Rebecca heard the comment and looked down. Shame pressed heavily against her. For years she had believed experience made her a good judge of character. Today had exposed a painful truth. Experience meant very little when assumptions came first. Outside, the last light of day began disappearing beyond the horizon. The runway lights flickered on one by one, stretching into the distance like glowing threads. Inside the cabin, Richard finished reviewing the proposal and slowly looked up. Relief appeared on his face for the first time all evening. "This could save the entire deal," he said quietly. Several executives exchanged hopeful looks. Elijah simply closed the folder. "Now we see whether they are willing to listen." At that exact moment, another message arrived on Richard's phone. He read it once. Then he looked directly at Elijah. And for the first time since boarding the aircraft, he smiled. Richard lowered his phone slowly, and the smile on his face immediately caught everyone's attention. For hours, every update had carried another problem, another delay, another reason to worry. This time was different. The tension that had weighed on his shoulders seemed lighter. They agreed to stay at the table, he said. Several executives released breaths they did not realize they had been holding. One man actually laughed from relief. Another closed his eyes for a brief moment and shook his head. The crisis that had threatened the entire expansion project was no longer spiraling out of control. Elijah listened quietly and nodded once. Good, he said. Now we can have a real conversation instead of a fearful one. Richard smiled. They reviewed your recommendations. Every one of them. A murmur spread through the group. The executives exchanged impressed looks. One of them leaned forward. They accepted the revised structure? Richard nodded. All of it. Even the passengers who had only partially followed the discussion could feel the significance of the moment. Something important had just happened. Something that would affect thousands of employees, future investments, and entire communities. Yet the man responsible sat calmly in seat 2A as though he had simply solved a crossword puzzle. Rebecca watched everything from a distance. Every minute seemed to reveal another reason people respected Elijah Carter. His intelligence was obvious. His influence was undeniable. But neither impressed her as much as his character. At any point he could have embarrassed her. He could have demanded consequences. He could have reminded everyone exactly who he was. Instead, he had spent the entire evening focused on helping others solve a problem. That realization hurt more than any corporate review ever could. A few rows away, a passenger finally gathered enough courage to approach him. Mr. Carter, the man said, I read about the scholarship program you started in Detroit. My daughter received one. Elijah looked genuinely surprised. She did. The man nodded proudly. She graduates next year. A warm smile appeared on Elijah's face. That is wonderful news. The passenger returned to his seat, visibly emotional. Rebecca felt her throat tighten again. Every story she discovered painted the same picture. Hospitals, scholarships, housing projects, emergency relief efforts. Elijah had spent years helping strangers he would never meet. Yet she had decided who he was before he spoke 10 words. The aircraft cabin grew quieter as darkness settled outside. Runway lights shimmered through the windows like distant stars. The reflection danced across the polished surfaces inside the jet. Richard sat beside Elijah and reviewed final documents. Several executives joined them. Their conversation flowed naturally now, confidently, optimistically. Then Richard paused. His expression became serious again. He glanced toward Rebecca before looking back at Elijah. There is one matter we still need to address, he said carefully. The surrounding executives immediately fell silent. Elijah followed Richard's gaze. For the first time all evening, his eyes settled on Rebecca. She felt her pulse hammering in her chest. The corporate review, the witness reports, the preserved footage. Everything suddenly felt real. Richard waited a moment before speaking again. Corporate leadership wants to know how you would like us to proceed. And the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath waiting for Elijah's answer. The silence that followed felt heavier than every conversation that had taken place aboard the aircraft that evening. Richard Whitmore waited patiently. The executives waited. The passengers waited. Even the flight crew seemed frozen in place. All eyes rested on Elijah Carter. Rebecca stood near the galley, barely breathing. She knew exactly what Richard was asking. The corporate review had already begun. Statements were being collected. Procedures were being examined. One recommendation from Elijah could change everything. He could demand accountability. He could insist on disciplinary action. He could make an example out of her. Nobody on board would have questioned it. In fact, many would probably have supported it. Richard folded his hands and remained silent. He understood the weight of the moment. The company was prepared to follow Elijah's wishes. Elijah looked toward the window for a moment. Beyond the glass, the runway lights stretched into the darkness. Small service vehicles moved in the distance beneath the night sky. The scene seemed peaceful compared to the tension inside the cabin. Finally, Elijah turned back toward Richard. What exactly are they asking? He said. Richard answered carefully. They want to know whether you wish to file a formal complaint. Several executives lowered their eyes. Rebecca felt her stomach drop. The words sounded simple, but everyone understood their significance. Elijah considered the question. Then he surprised everyone. Before tonight, he said, how many years has Rebecca worked for this airline? Richard blinked. The question was unexpected. One executive checked a tablet. Almost 12 years, he replied. Elijah nodded slowly. And how has her record been? The executive looked down again. Excellent. No major complaints. Consistently high performance evaluations. A ripple of confusion moved through the cabin. This was not the direction anyone expected the conversation to take. Rebecca looked up for the first time. Elijah's expression remained calm, thoughtful, measured. Then perhaps we should remember that one moment does not define an entire life, he said quietly. The words settled over the cabin like a warm light. Several passengers exchanged surprised glances. Richard remained silent for a moment. You do not want to proceed with a complaint? He asked. Elijah shook his head. I want the company to learn from what happened. I want people to think carefully before making assumptions about others. But I do not believe destroying someone's career teaches that lesson. Rebecca felt tears gathering in her eyes. She quickly looked away. The shame she carried was still there. The regret was still there. But now it was mixed with something else. Gratitude. Around the cabin, passengers who had witnessed the entire ordeal seemed equally moved. One elderly woman quietly smiled. Another passenger lowered his head in thought. The lesson had become larger than a single misunderstanding. It had become a reflection of how easily people judge strangers without knowing their story. Richard finally nodded. I understand. His voice carried genuine respect. Elijah smiled faintly and closed the folder beside him. The crisis threatening the business deal had been solved. The question of the complaint had been answered. Everything should have been settled. Yet as Rebecca looked down at the tablet still in her hands, she noticed one final notification from corporate leadership. And what she read next made her heart race all over again. Rebecca stared at the notification for several seconds before lowering the tablet. The message was not a punishment. It was not a termination notice. It was not even a disciplinary action. Corporate leadership had ordered a company-wide review of customer service training and bias awareness procedures. The incident aboard the aircraft would be used as a learning case for future employees. Rebecca felt an unexpected wave of emotion. The company was not trying to destroy her. They were trying to learn from what had happened. Slowly, she looked toward Elijah Carter. The cabin had grown quiet again. Most of the passengers had returned to their seats. The executives were reviewing final documents. Outside the windows, the runway lights stretched into the darkness like silver threads. The aircraft finally felt ready to leave the ground. Gathering her courage, Rebecca stepped forward. Every footstep felt heavier than the last. When she reached Elijah's seat, she stopped. For a moment, she could not find the words. Then she took a slow breath. Mr. Carter, she said softly. Elijah looked up. Yes. Rebecca lowered her eyes. I was wrong. The simple sentence seemed to carry the weight of the entire evening. I judged you before I knew anything about you. I made assumptions I should never have made. I am truly sorry. The cabin remained silent. Several passengers quietly listened. Elijah studied her for a moment. Then he smiled gently. Not the smile of someone who had won. Not the smile of someone enjoying another person's discomfort. It was the smile of someone who understood that people could change. Thank you for saying that, he replied. Rebecca nodded. I will never forget this lesson. Elijah glanced toward the window. The reflection of the runway lights shimmered across the glass. Neither will I, he said. Richard Whitmore watched the exchange from a few rows away. A faint smile appeared on his face. He had spent years working with powerful executives, investors, and politicians. Yet moments like this reminded him what true leadership looked like. It was not about power. It was not about status. It was not about making people fear you. It was about choosing wisdom when pride would be easier. A few minutes later, the aircraft door closed. The engines gradually increased in volume. Passengers secured their seat belts. The final documents were signed. The crisis was over. The partnership had been saved. The future of the company looked brighter than it had only hours earlier. As the aircraft began moving toward the runway, Rebecca returned to her duties. But she was not the same person who had started that shift. Across the cabin, Elijah sat quietly beside the window, watching the lights pass by in the darkness. He did not celebrate. He did not boast. He simply looked peaceful. The jet accelerated down the runway and lifted smoothly into the night sky. Below them, the city lights grew smaller and smaller until they looked like distant stars. Inside the cabin, no one spoke for a while. They simply sat with their thoughts. And somewhere between the runway and the clouds, everyone aboard that flight learned the same lesson. The value of a person can never be measured by appearance, assumptions, or first impressions. Because the moment we think we know someone's story at first glance may be the moment we understand them the least.